Out of the mists of the distant past, a river rose. She ran her course south into the sea. The ice came, and when it went, it left behind the moraines and the mountains. LIVIA changed her course, and then she hungered after the close-by pastures of Kildare in the west. Here she would water the lush forest through which great elks stalked. Later, the acorns she nourished would become towering oaks. Here, the lineage of those oaks still stand. Beneath them in the ground were the bones of the great elks that roamed the earlier forests. The river, LIVIA herself, though ancient and old, still lives on, vibrant and vivacious. This was LIVIA from the earliest. Flowing still, she turned to the east, searching for a suitable entry to Mother Sea. And she found her city, Dublin. It would become her head, her bay, Baile Átha Cliath. On her way to that city, she had created great gorges and valleys along her path. Modern man has come to change her course to recreate those lochs that disappeared over countless years ago. Today, from her great energy are generated new sources of power, like here at Bulafuka. Along its great valleys, lush forests were to grow. This was ancient LIVIA. Here was to be her head, Dublin, the Black Pool. Beyond this pool, she found her entry to Dublin Bay, between ancient Bean Éidir at Howth and Bray Head on the south. Dublin, Baile Átha Cliath. She was to be the first ever town in the island of Ireland. Rome, great Rome at the height of its power, only sent emissaries to search this strange land. Ptolemy, the Greek map maker, would chart it in the 2nd century. He called it Ablana. Agricola, the Roman governor of Britain, was to send unpromising reports to his emperor. Hibernia could develop outside their vast Roman Empire. Yet on a clear day, Bean Éidir could be seen only 80 miles across the Irish Sea from the Welsh coast. Dublin, a hostile, unpromising bay, and beyond it, forests and a colder climate. No place for Roman troops. And so, Dublin stayed for many centuries. Primitive she was, wild she was, but relatively peaceful. Her river, untamed, unbridged, unsettled. The ancient Celt came, their clans crossed on business or battle here at the ford of the Hurdles, Baile Átha Cliath. Here they chose to have their crossing for the great ways that headed north to Tara and its High King, or east to pillage the nearby island called Britain. LIVIA ran through lush, rich pastures to nourish cattle in their valleys, and here they built cranogues and wattle forts. But already at its head, the river was the venue for strange visitors. Patrick and his monks. He landed in Ireland in 432 and baptized these primitive people. Then later, in the 700s, the Norse came, only to find sparse shore dwellers. Early man erected strange stone monuments, dolmens, around the river's head. The Norse, a strange mixture of adventure and civilization, came in large numbers. Their attention focused on this island and its great bay with its river god, LIVIA. In their long boats, they settled here. They drove the dwellers out. They found a pool, Dublin, Black Pool, and here they washed and bathed, gazed on by the natives, curious of their comings and goings. They made their ware, their jewellery, their instruments, their wattle shelters. They caught or raised their food, rabbit, fish, wild berries. All of this would be revealed 1,000 years on, when the Dublin of its day would dig in the 1960s a foundation for a new city hall at Wood Quay. Unearthed in these excavations was first the modern, then the medieval, and beneath the medieval was the mysterious, the Viking village. Here on High Street was the centre of Norse power. Running down to Wood Quay on the Liffey shore, one could still see the 5 rivers of the bay. The Dodder and the Tolka are still to be seen. In the fabric of the city deep down, the other sister streams somewhere lie buried. Here, those early Norse adventurers built their Thing Mount, their high platform of earth. Here they erected their sacred stone, the Stein, some 10 foot high. All of this not far from today's College Green. Here they would meet, decide, distribute, dictate, and design. The later native Celtic monks moved among them. Some Norse would listen, even marry into these people, becoming Christian. Others would feel bound by their old god Balor in their ways. Those early arrivals of Norse were superseded by a second wave from the northern distant shores of Europe. Their cousins, the Scandinavian Vikings. The Vikings came at the early 10th century only to conquer, to ravish, to raid, to supplant the native power. True such, the Norsemen in Dublin were now half native. By the end of the 10th century, caught in this predicament, the Dublin Norse continued to trade, be trusted, their loyalty not suspect. Left alone, those that adhered to the new faith brought by Patrick set down foundations for their early churches. These were made of mud and timber, and they rose around the river. And later, these would be replaced by stone-like structures on the very site on which they had stood. St. Aldwyn's, St. Patrick's, Christ Church, St. Michan's. Deep down were early Norse foundations. These were the sites of the Norse Dublin town. Down from here was to be All Hallows, later the grounds of the college called Trinity. An uneasy peace held for some hundreds of years between these invading Vikings and the native Celtic chief. And then the High King at Tara, some 50 miles away, demanded tribute money. The pendulum of peace was to swing to and fro. The Gaelic and the Norse agreed terms here at Chapelizod, and the city was to have peace in 992. But all that was to end when Brudor, the Viking warlord, challenged Brian Boru to combat at Clontarf on Good Friday, 1014. The Danes lost and the invading Vikings retreated. The Norse king, Sitrick, was confined to the city. His influence continued, and the skills of these people were assimilated by native craftsmen. With the gradual Christianization of their Norse culture, their work would encompass a magnificent example of chalices, book covers, croziers, and jewellery. Today, side by side, they're on view in the National Museum under the one roof, oblivious of their divergent origins, open to the admiration of all who visit there. From 1014, these Hiberno Norse were subjected to pay tribute to the High King. They elected to stay. They loved their city. Those who stayed spread across Anna Livia towards the northern country pastures, Rush, Lusk. Here their colonies would be an early integration of cultures with the Celts. No ethnic cleansing then, clearly quite the contrary. Littered along the coast and and up the estuaries, where they felt the closeness of the shores, they would build their moats and palisades. On the rich, expansive flat fields of Fingal, they found a home. Their palisades would become fortified and churched. Where today Dublin's international airport stands, stood the early fort, Knocksedan. Then, in 1170, a wave of newcomers came across the Irish Sea. These were the Normans. Theirs was a technically advanced order of society. England in 1066 succumbed to William the Norman Conqueror. The island of Ireland seemed to be his next logical conquest. But Norman numbers were limited. Adventurers, in great part mainly. When they arrived, deals had to be done. Native rule had to be subjected. The English king was to be Lord of Ireland. The existing order was reinforced in Norman stone and held by Norman armour. Indeed, they said they spoke in the Pope's name. The monks were silenced and great orders were given over to the Norman-favoured abbeys. Amongst those in Dublin was All Hallows, an early site of the Augustinians. Somewhere deep down under the existing cobblestones of Trinity College lies the nave of this ancient abbey. Close by, under the Provost House, can still be found the well in which it was reputed St. Patrick baptized his first Christian men and women in those early centuries. Now, in 1170, the city was to have a new Norman ruler called Strongbow. His tomb remains today in Christ Church. The city slipped from control of the early Hiberno-Norse. The English influence of the Normans was firmly established. Strongbow was the figurehead of power. Married to Princess Aoife, daughter of the Leinster king, she was to become a pawn in a greater struggle for ascendancy over the whole island. Here, Dublin and its possession reflected the seal of that authority. Dublin Castle, itself a fortified, impregnable bastion. But all this was to take a long time, some 700 years, from 840 to 1540. In those years, the citizenry of Dublin developed from that early society of Hiberno-Norse, which met at the Thingmount, to building what was to become a city hall, the Fáilsel, up in High Street. During that period of 700 years, the city of Dublin was divided between a great number of cultures. These cultures reflected the diversity to be found, even in its languages. Gaelic from the native, Norse, French from the Normans, and finally English reflected its rulers. The castle and the cathedral within the city walls were the domain of power. The town blossomed also outside its walls. The city, as seen from the original map, was entered by a series of gates: Castle, Dame, later Ormond, and Newgate. James's Gate was found outside by a certain brewery in much later early 18th century. It was the waters of the Camac which flowed down by James's Gate, which led to the brewing there of one Arthur Guinness. But Dublin had yet to become developed at its port, and to this we must turn, to a great name reflected on its quayside wherever we go, and that is the name of Ormond. In the 1600s, the taste was still for the wars, not only at home but abroad. Some such soldiers of fortune returned to die in their native city, like the anonymous crusader at St. Michan's. Having returned from expeditions abroad, they passed their end days in the numerous alehouses and hostelries around the LIVIA. Here, in Dublin's oldest inn, such would meet side by side to exchange memories of their past. When the flamboyant, fun-loving Charles I of England was displaced by the dour Cromwell, the king's cavaliers found sanctuary in foreign exploits. Now they were coming back. Such a one was James Butler, Earl of Ormond. Who were the Ormonds? They were a Norman knight family. Some had settled in Kilkenny, Some had sided with their King Charles and suffered exile in the Orient. With the restoration of the monarchy, this Ormond returned. He landed right here on Anna Livia's shore at Ringsend in the 1650s. As he stepped ashore, it said the natives of Irish Town sang Céad Míle Fáilte Romhaibh. Such was their joy at the return of such a great name to command the city. A city ruled by the sea in savagery and storm of Dublin Bay. A city whose ships stood at the mercy of its shifting sands. A city centre which was subject to tidal flooding. For safety, the custom house stood well upriver at Essex, which is now known as Capel Street Bridge. Ormond saw all this. A visionary, as well as a man of action, he knew where his future and his fortune lay. Here in Dublin, with Anna Livia, he would civilise this savage lady. He had the power. He would contain the sprawling river's flow within great cut-stone quays. He would turn the city to the river. Along its quays, elegant buildings would face the river, acknowledging Anna Livia's beauty. Ormond sought some 2,000 acres to create a royal deer park, but King Charles had other plans for it. He commanded architect Robinson in 1680 to build a royal hospital for retired soldiers who had served him loyally. Chelsea and London would follow this example 2 years later. The Royal Hospital. It stands restored faithfully today, not only as a monument of concern for faithful service, but a testimony of the earliest Irish architectural endeavour in the neoclassical style. Today, the Royal Hospital Kilmainham also houses the Museum of Modern Art. But back in Ormond's time, in that era of the middle 17th century, efforts at creating a Phoenix deer park proceeded on the north bank of the Liffey. There was a Phoenix house there since early 1600s. It was at St. Thomas's Hill. It was demolished when, in Swift's immortal words, a magazine fort was built in 1734. Behold proof of Irish sense, here Irish art is seen. When nothing's left that's worth defence, they build a magazine. The magazine hill is in ruins today, but there are plans for its restoration. In the park itself are buildings of importance such as Áras an Uachtaráin, the President's House. Originally a modest range warden's lodge, we see it today as a Palladian structure, fitting for the office of the vice-regal. It was dressed in the Palladian style, as ordered by the authorities, under the hand of the eminent Irish architect Francis Johnson. It was Johnson also who is credited with the final style of the Nelson Pillar, planted in Dublin's Sackville Street in 1808. Johnson's other addition to Dublin was the ornate James's Gate. Originally it stood at the Guinness Brewery. It was moved much later to the Royal Hospital, and it stands in stark contrast to the jail entrance at Kilmainham. In the 1700s, Charlemont's volunteers of the Old Irish Parliament stressed their independence of action by parading in full regalia and muskets over its Phoenix acres. Again, during troubled times between the Union of the 1800s and the 1916 Rising, the park would host assemblies demonstrating defiance of the very authority which resided there. Charlemont's volunteers would be followed by the United Irishmen. They in turn by the Fenians, later still the modern Irish Volunteers. Royalty, rebels and Redmondites all featured in the park's long history. In modern times, presidential and papal appearances such as the visit of Pope John Paul in 1979 attracted over 1 million people to the Phoenix Park, as did the Eucharistic Congress of 1932.
To greet you in the name of the Holy Father and to bestow on you his blessing.
The park has become, with its zoological gardens, its historical monuments, part and parcel of the people of Dublin. It served many uses in good and troubled times, even to the point of being used as the nation's fuel depot, full of turf tanks during the scarcity of the war years 1939 to 45. But one of its most endearing features to Dubliners today and visitors alike is as a reserve for its deer. And and today they still lend a graceful touch of royal elegance to the Phoenix Park. The parks afforded public open space close to the city in those years of the late 18th century. People could leave their hovels in the city and pass by the elegant houses on Ormond's Quay as they made their way there. They passed the Blue Coat School, called Blue Coat after the distinctive uniform of the pupils attending Sons of Citizens of Reduced Income, officially the King's Hospital School. It was the work of Ivory the architect. Napper Tandy, the United Irishman, was school governor there in 1789. Today, it is the home of the Incorporated Law Society. On the way to the park, people would pass the Royal, now Collins's Barracks. Founded in 1706, it is the oldest military barracks in the world. Further up the river, the new Customs House replaced the ancient one in 1790. Upstream, one would encounter the forecourts. Also in College Green, the great Grattan Parliament stood supreme. The citizens in general in Dublin of the 18th century depended on the benevolence of an elite ruling class. So it was that to the open areas of park around the city, or to the perimeter of its shores, Dubliners, princes and paupers, resorted for recreation. Temple Bar was at the centre of the old city at the turn of the 19th century, and it was a place of hostels and taverns. And amongst those stood at one time St. Cecilia's Medical School, which has now been faithfully restored. It was at the corner of Crow Street. It was to be the first medical school of its time. From its student ranks would be staffed the soon-to-be established Jervis Street Hospital. In Temple Bar also, a plaque recalls the mystery of the Ouzel Galley sailing ship. She was reported lost in 1695, but returned in 1700, laden with treasure and all safely aboard. And she had a tale to tell of her capture by lurking pirates. Eventually, her crew overcame the captors, seizing their treasure. The eventual safe return and deliberations on who owned what was of great significance at the time. To settle the question, an arbitration board was formed, which was called the Ouzel Galley Society, and it solved the dispute. And this society itself eventually became Dublin's Chamber of Commerce. Nearby in Eustace Street, in what is the Quakers' meeting place, a plaque commemorates the original drafting of the 1798 United Irishmen Declaration. Down from Temple Bar, through Merchant's Arch and across the bridge, one arrived at Mary's Abbey ruins, and on to Green Street, one would come by the courthouse. Even more dreaded than it, alongside stood the debtors' jail. Those unfortunate enough to land in bankruptcy longed for some miracle to rescue them from that rotten place. For those that rebelled in any armed way against this oppressive regime, there was the confinement of nearby Newgate Jail. Within, the death penalty was carried out, hanged, drawn, quartered. A short distance away, deep down in the crypt of one of Dublin's oldest north side churches, St. Michan's, lie the mummified remains of two such rebels. In eerie silence, in this rarefied atmosphere of strange soil, lie the Shears brothers. Even the hardest of hearts would have heeded the pleas of eldest brother John to spare younger brother Henry, whose wife was with child. Both of a respected Dublin family, arrested while the leaders of the rebellion had hid or fled, they were executed in 1798. Such was the demand for incarceration as the old 18th century turned into the new, that the jail at Kilmainham had to be enlarged. That building, Kilmainham, was to enter the annals of the struggle for Ireland's freedom. In 1803, romantic rebel Robert Emmet, of an eminent Protestant family and student at Trinity, led an abortive rebellion. And outside St. Catherine's Church, where his execution took place, Emmet declared his own epitaph. When my country takes her place among the nations of the earth, then, and not till then, let my epitaph be written. And those words would become an inspiration to a later generation. His death on the scaffold in 1803 marked the end of an era. His grave, wherever it is, was never discovered. However, nearby, resting in the silent crypt of ancient St. Werburgh's, lie the mortal remains of a romantic rebel, Lord Edward Fitzgerald, of 1798 fame. Dublin now began its descent from its zenith of glory to a vortex of cruelty, from its apex of richness to its pit of poverty. The South City had boasted some of the most pleasant open spaces for its citizens back as the early 1600s. Indeed, in the middle of the 17th century, the mayor had preserved for posterity not only one, but three great open parklands: Oxman Town, All Hallows, and Stephen's Green. Of these, now only one survives to modern times, and that reduced by almost a half. The eventual survival of St. Stephen's Green, as such, can be attributed to the foresight and generosity of Sir Benjamin Lee Guinness, later Lord Ardilaun. The Green was too tempting for a corrupt corporation of its day, so to fill its coffers and cancel debts, it sold off surrounding plots on four sides, which now form the present-day Stephen's Green. The central existing green area, the mayor of the day preserved for his own private pasture for animals. Graceful buildings appeared over time, this despite the lack of any real coherent plan. Such were the College of Surgeons, the clubs, the houses, the hotels. The Earl of Shelburne's house at Kildare Street Corner was to keep its name. In the early 1800s, it became the Shelburne Hotel. Other people at that time who secured some plot of the early Green were the Huguenots. They had come to Ireland from persecution in France. Here, in that peaceful woodland, they provided a cemetery for themselves in their exile. It is fitting that they rest now so near the city in Dublin, a city to which they brought not only their beliefs, but also their skills and crafts to the benefit of Anna Livia's citizens. Along the green perimeter were laid out pleasant walks on its four sides. The mayor could saunter up from the fine new mansion house which the corporation had bought for him in Dawson Street. The authorities had, in those early 1700s, used that whole area as a public hanging place. One young 13-year-old girl called Crichton paid the heavy penalty for pinching a calico gown. It was after the public gallows was moved from that place that fine houses were built. The townhouse of the Earl Ross, later Ivy House, now the Department of Foreign Affairs. The gambler Buck Whaley grew up in number 86, which his father had built. This was to become Newman House, the place of the university, under Catholic Cardinal Newman in the early 1800s. It was well into the first half of the 19th century that fashionable Grafton Street became established. But the inner city itself would change before the 19th century. From an open ancient city with historical heart, it was to become a formalized city of elegant squares, wide streets, and hidden squalor. In that parliamentary system of peerage, cosmopolitan Dublin prior to 1800 became the second city of the empire. A contradictory approach to a city and the country was evident in its parliament. Protestant, exclusive, and patriotic, all at the same time. Enlightened but dependent, caring but corrupt. Here, its fine House of Parliament in College Green, which had been built over nearly 60 years. Boldly, it declared its independence in 1782, but it was not to enjoy its independence, not even for 20 years. It was eventually abolished by an act of union helped by its own corruption in 1800. Yet even today, its dedicated orators still seem to speak through the magnificence of that classic structure of College Green. Grattan, the noble leader of the patriotic party, still stands watching. The magnificence of the Irish House of Lords has been retained along with some of the possessions of the day, including the ornate mace. All of these in the safekeeping of the Bank of Ireland, which acquired them in the early 1800s. During that period, from 1730 on, Dublin aspired to a cultural role which placed it above the capitals of the other European cities. It was the Dublin of Swift, Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Swift held that place in the first 50 years of the 18th century. He was 22 when the Battle of the Boyne caused him to quit Trinity for the safety of England. He's best remembered for his Gulliver's Travels. It was in reality a condemnation of the politicians of his day. His amorous life and association with many unique society figures of his time is a lore in itself. Names like Stella and Vanessa. Dublin was a society which listened to the great German organist and composer Handel. It saw artists come here to perform, the great actors David Garrick and Peg Woffington. But Swift was the man of Dublin, and Dubliners adored him. They made him a freeman of the city in 1730. The great architects Gandon, Ivory, Cassels and Pearce completed Dublin by the 19th century. The Georgian north side basked in splendour, with the wonderful houses of the Gardners, the Charlemagnes, the Forecourts, the Custom House, Mountjoy Square, Lord Charlemagne's house and the casino he built at Marino, a pure gem of neoclassical architecture. On the south side, there was the recurrent problem of the River Liffey flooding, and indeed there is one story recounting how a party with his lordship Fitzwilliam, they were able to sail from Ringsend up to the present-day site of Merrion Square. Indeed, Captain Bligh, of Bounty fame, had referred to this recurrent problem of the River Liffey flooding as far back as 1800. But it fell to another great figure to secure a complete solution, and he was the outstanding engineer of his time, Bindon Blood Stoney. He, Stoney, had inherited a port which had not yet matured to the commerce of the great steamers and clippers. During the famine years of the 1840s in Dublin, Stoney had witnessed some of the most devastating scenes as people from the outward regions came into the food kitchens set up to dispense food to them. One indeed in the fashionable Merrion Square. There, a massive soup kitchen dispensed a vegetarian soup to the paupers of the time. No less a person than the famed French chef Soyer was brought in to command this operation. Most of these unfortunate victims were on their way to a new life across the Atlantic in North America. For some, it was to be a dream come true. For others, an eventual nightmare ending in death. Along with Bindon Blood Stoney, the early Victorian era of the mid-19th century was stamped by another great figure in Dublin, William Dargan. He was the railway king. He now graced the city with his railway termini of classical style, King's Bridge being a fine example. But Dargan's accomplishments were to eclipse to a great extent the accomplishments of the innovators of the waterways, with their canals which come to connect at Anna Livia's Head, Dublin port. Canals also provided drinking water for an expanding city. Today, at Portobello and Blessington Street, stand these strange, silent, infilled docks. Bulky barges at the turn of the last century left here laden with goods for country towns all over Ireland. They would return with country produce. The hotels along their banks and waysides would provide elegant luxury for passengers travelling at an astounding 8 miles an hour. The bridges, all but Venetian in character. Stoney chose to live his years in his adopted city of Dublin, close by canals, in the elegance of Wellington and Waterloo roads. Discarded today on the quay's edge is his great diving bell, which enabled work to proceed on those graving docks. That great dredging had been undertaken to render Dublin port suitable for the traffic of its day. A floating shears was another of his inventions, a model of which still exists in Trinity College. Without any great sense of awareness of what they were doing, such men as Stoney and Dargan and the great Victorian builders of the mid-19th century were shaping Dublin city anew. Pedestrians were accommodated by the building of the elegant cast-iron Halfpenny Bridge, the first toll bridge across Anna Livia. The Dublin of its day had a vantage point from which you viewed it. Nelson's column, now gone. In the middle of O'Connell Street, Nelson Pillar charged a few pence to gain a panoramic view over the city. A later edition of that 19th century was the Wellington Monument in the historic Phoenix Park. 205 feet high. Fortunately for the city, its early advocates did not succeed in having it sited in the middle of Merrion Square. In 1886, a vessel called at the port, causing some controversy. That great, massive ship, the Great Eastern, had finished its cable-laying tasks of the ocean connecting continents. 20 years previously, in 1866, she had successfully connected by transatlantic cable Valentia in Kerry, Ireland, with Heart's Content, Newfoundland. The ship, 700 feet in length by 80 feet breadth, occupied a large space at the Liffey entrance. The populace were excited at the sight of its 6 masts and 5 funnels. This was the largest ship in the world, the brainchild of that king of engineers, Brunel. For almost 6 months, Dubliners had the chance to visit or gaze upon it before it was forced to move. Its gigantic appearance could only be said to be matched by the presence of a towering figure in the field of politics, Charles Stewart Parnell. 2 gigantic figures find their monuments placed at opposite ends of Dublin's prime avenue, the O'Connell Monument and the Parnell Monument. O'Connell's was the way of public petition, Parnell's way of Parliament at Westminster. What happened when Lord Frederick Cavendish, Chief Secretary, and his Under-Secretary Burke set out for a short stroll across from the Viceregal Lodge in the Phoenix Park one early morning in May 1880, rocked Parnell. A garden ranger recalled how he thought he saw a gentleman engaged in combat among the trees in the early morning. Afterwards, among the leaves, their bodies were found. They were the victims of the secret, extreme, violent separatists called the Invincibles. A coach was seen speeding out the Knockmaroon Gate after the deadly deed. The Times of London tried to link the murders with Charles Stewart Parnell. Who was this Charles Stewart Parnell? Called at his political peak the uncrowned King of Ireland. He came of a wealthy Protestant landowning family at Avondale, County Wicklow. On his paternal side, an ancestor was Sir John Parnell of the College Green Parliament, its Chancellor of the Exchequer and a member of the Patriotic Party. But Bachelor Parnell became involved with the wife of one of his parliamentary party colleagues, Cathy O'Shea. Parnell had survived the plots of opponents to become a victim now of his own intrigue. This involved a trio relationship between Parnell and Kitty O'Shea on the one side and her husband, Captain William O'Shea, on the other. Parnell's name was constantly in the Times of London. In 1886, the Times tried to implicate Charles Stewart Parnell with the Invincible murders of some years previously. The Times claimed that letters they would produce would implicate him in that murder. After a long and lengthy trial, Parnell's name was vindicated. The letters proven to be the work of a forger called Piggott. But Parnell's name was before the public eye daily. When therefore Parnell practically imposed his friend O'Shea as a parliamentary candidate for Galway in the general election of that year, his motives were suspect. His personal conduct and relationship with the O'Sheas were put under the microscope. And she, Mrs. O'Shea, would be dismissed by the press as Kitty, an insulting terminology of the time. Prior to this, their meetings had been secret by arrangement at the oddest of hours and places. They had managed to live a life together out of the public gaze. But from this time on, 1886, Parnell in his private and public life was under constant pressure. Ensuing actions, including one for divorce by Captain O'Shea, brought him and his leadership of the Irish Parliamentary Party into disrepute and eventual dispute. Private odium was followed by public and church withdrawal of support. But Parnell tenaciously hung on in 1890, trying to keep control. He held monster meetings to garnish ebbing support. He depended on his eloquence as a public speaker. He married Kitty O'Shea in June of 1891, and in October of that year, at the age of 48, he died in her arms, an exhausted, ill, and defeated man. An era in Irish politics and history had come to an end. The early innovators of the city's industry and progress were gone. Their place would be taken by the exploiters of overabundant cheap labour. In those closing years of the 19th century, the only escape for the Dubliner of the day was to join up, to go to fight the Empire's wars, first in the Crimea against the Russians, and then later at the turn of the century to secure South Africa for the Empire against the Boers. Many had to, many just did. For the women there was no such relief. The luckier ones got employment in London. And then there was the most famous woman of her time, the great female warrior of the reviving nation, Countess Markievicz. There are two monuments in Stephen's Green. One is the Fusiliers' Arch, a nation's memory of a manhood who fought for the British Empire. The other is the Markievicz Monument. It overlooks the Keeper's Lodge, which she occupied during the 1916 rebellion. Each of these monuments is seated diametrically at east and west sides of St. Stephen's Green. They illustrate the conflicting thoughts that predominated in the city in that early 20th century. Others had different ways, literary, artistic ways, through which they sought a change in their circumstances. A renaissance of Irish literature came about, but this time the writers and artists acknowledged the poverty in their midst. St. Mary's Pro-Cathedral would grow up alongside the greatest ghetto ever seen in any European city. Opposite, a street affectionately known as Monto, was an area of illicit beer saloons, gambling, other unspoken pastimes, and it was given the unofficial nod and wink. This was the device, apparently, to pacify a population living in deprivation. And the government sphere was any organisation of this disaffection. Now it was being voiced by Larkin, the Labour leader. The Irish Parliamentary Party was in disgrace. The Empire flourished. Only a minority of intelligentsia threatened this. Then the Protestant Douglas Hyde spoke of a Celtic city, Baile Átha. The poets, and Joyce, and the mystics, Yeats and Synge, all joined in that early Irish revival. Dublin was its centre. Then James Connolly, the socialist, looked at the people in his city and their plight, and he resolved on retribution. 1913, the date, the great transport system of trams, which had served Dublin and electrified since 1880s, they had suddenly been brought to a stop. The drivers would no longer stand for the treatment meted out by their bosses. They revolted. They met, only to be baton-charged in Dublin's city centre, Sackville Street. But repression did not succeed in stamping out that spirit. It was as if the great city gates of old were flung open. Now flocked the young men and women to join an army of revolt against oppression. They could choose a citizen army of Connolly, the patriotic army of Pearse, the volunteer army of Redmond. The rebel women of LIVIA became Cumann na mBan. Then, 1914. Things were at a knife edge when an assassin's bullet in Serbia brought on that great conflict known as World War I. And then these Dublin men and women had to choose which cause, which fight, which words to follow, which war, which army to join in 1914. Into this strange complex entered the figure of Edward Carson with his Ulster Volunteers. Ironically, he was Dublin-born, eminent attorney and opponent of change. Obstruction was his answer. Ulster would fight, and Ulster would be right. The Home Rule Bill was the enemy. Irish Unionists were supported by their own officer class at the Curragh Military Academy. They mutinied. They brought in arms for their Ulster Volunteers from Germany. In Dublin, the National Volunteers would follow suit. And here today stands the silent Asgard, which in May 1913 sailed to Howth with the young seafaring Erskine Childers. Smuggled aboard was his catchment of arms for the 1,000 Dublin-based volunteers. They hoped the threat of arms alone would force the Crown to grant Dublin Home Rule. They landed the arms at Howth, some 8 miles out of the city. They were relieved to reach the safety of the city centre later that spring evening. But then they were intercepted. The first shots of a war of freedom had been fired by the English forces. This was Dublin's Boston Tea Party, its Bull Run, its Verdun, its Thermopylae. The stage was set for change, away from demonstration, away from protestation. It was the baptism of action here and now. In Yeats's words, a terrible beauty was born. Ireland's call to arms came, but not with one voice, but with conflicting chorus of different and deafening tones. Ireland unfree shall never be at peace, said Pearse at O'Donovan Ross's graveside in 1913. In the Phoenix Park, Redmond summoned his national volunteers to join up for the crown. They joined Connolly to fight for the freedom of workers and women. They joined Carson to fight for the freedom of their religion and laws. 1914, 1915, 1916, they all joined. They fought, some in the Somme with the Dublin and Enniskillen Fusiliers. Some in Sackville Street, the Irish volunteers in the GPO. When they had done, their world and their city had suffered like never before. What had started out as a call to arms had ended in carnage. Dubliners were divided. Their city they saw destroyed, their sons slaughtered. A confused reaction to the events that first developed. Blame those in rebellion, said some. In the city itself, the castle security had not been breached. The college at Trinity was held by the Crown. The North and South City volunteers split in the centre. De Valera held the Grand Canal against overwhelming odds. British reinforcements from Kingstown were beaten back at Mount Street by a young Lieutenant Malone. But Pearse spared the city slaughter. He surrendered to General Maxwell. Foolish counsel in the Crown forces failed to respond to Pearse's overture. Indeed, Markovitch and her warrior women held out to the very last, incredulous of any clemency from an alien force. And they were proved to be right. Within the week, all that signed that proclamation were dead. The octogenarian Clark, the Fenian of old, the first to sign, was the first to die. Their bodies taken from the yard at Kilmainham Jail, buried in lime at Arbor Hill. A monument marks the spot. The poet Joseph Mary Plunkett was to leave behind his bride of one day, Grace Gifford. No flowers for their marriage would grace his grave. He wrote, "This heritage to the race of kings, their children and their children's seed, have wrought their prophecies indeed of terrible and splendid things." As if to provoke the population of Dublin, the leading pacifist Sheehy Skeffington, no advocate of arms, was brutally murdered by British interrogators in Portobello Barracks. The city shelled, the city shocked, the city stunned, 1916. The Troubles, the years that followed. Then began the great education of the revolution in Frongoch prison camp in Wales for those lucky enough, like De Valera, to be caught and court-martialed. They formed a university of revolution there and waited for the Great War to end. Green and Orange fought on the same side of the war against the Germans, and they came home in 1918 to a different Ireland. An election was held, and out of that election sprang a new party dedicated to the policy of ourselves alone. In the Gaelic language, Sinn Féin. They met in the historic Mansion House. This round room in the Mansion House had been built specifically to welcome the English monarch, George IV, in the 1820s. The first meeting of this parliament called itself the Dáil. It took for itself the existing power and to legislate for the Irish people. It appointed from its elected ranks ministers and others dedicated and determined enough to form a government. It was at first ignored, but gradually came under threat by the Crown forces. Those years of 1918 to 1921 were years when an old country became a new nation. Those 4 years saw deeds of heroism and cowardice, suffering and struggle. In 1920, Eamon de Valera was elected its president. He sought to get official loans to fund and finance the independence struggle. Republican bonds were issued. Courts at all levels were established. De Valera set out for America to raise support for the national effort to gain independence. He compared Ireland's right to freedom to that of Belgium's. Many Irish people, not necessarily Republicans, would have been in complete agreement with him. On this basis, he prepared to send emissaries to the Paris Peace Convention in 1920. The Dáil itself had been proscribed. Dublin Metropolitan Police tried to enter it. Irish men returning from British Army duties abroad joined the volunteer movement to protect their freely elected parliament. Dublin City saw military action on a major scale. The assassination of British Secret Service agents by a Michael Collins squad was the signal for a retaliatory shooting dead of over a dozen spectators in Croke Park. This was to be called Bloody Sunday. The authority of the Dáil was becoming recognised at home and abroad. Lloyd George realised he would not solve this new situation with a convention. All knew the situation. It had become make or break with the volunteers. The Dáil was on one side, the Crown forces and their masters on the other. In 1920, the volunteers attacked and burned the Custom House offices, the nerve centre of the British local government and its administration. The Dáil met on May the 10th, 1921, for the last time. In the election that followed, 124 of them were returned unopposed. Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, realised that he could not win. He called a meeting in the historic Mansion House on the 11th of July, 1921. A truce was signed between the British and Irish forces. Out of that truce emerged a treaty to be negotiated between Dáil Éireann and the Westminster Parliament. Collins and Griffiths led the Irish delegation to London. Eamon de Valera stayed in Dublin to conduct national affairs. This was to prove to be a fatal flaw in the fabric of those December 1921 meetings in an excited London. Under awful threat, some said, Collins signed. Or was his concentration perhaps distracted by his surroundings or the lovely Lady Lavery? It was at her husband's house in London that many of the meetings of the Irish delegation were held. He, Sir John Lavery, was to gain fame as a portrait painter, and his wife was later to pose as Éire, Ireland, for the new currency to be introduced by the Irish Free State. De Valera was said to be disgusted with the terms of this negotiated treaty, especially with its required oath of allegiance to the king by Dáil deputies. Sadly, this was to be the signal of what came to be called the split. People who had stood shoulder to shoulder in a common cause now faced each other as antagonists. Household names like Collins and Griffiths would be linked on the pro-treaty side, the names of De Valera and Markovich on the other. Enormous efforts to bring both sides together ended in failure. Already in 1922, the procedures to set up a new Irish Free State were underway. Overlooking St. Stephen's Green, the Shelburne stands elegantly poised at the corner of Kildare Street. It was to play host to an important group of people in the now named Constitution Room. Here, in February 1922, General Michael Collins chaired the first meeting of the committee to draft that document. Even as they did so, the opponents to the treaty had taken to arms. In the city, one of the earliest actions in the Civil War was the Four Courts occupation. Under the command of Republican Rory O'Connor, it became the target of artillery from the new National Army. It had borrowed heavy field equipment from the departing Crown forces. To this day, the marks on the forecourt columns recall that event. Damage to this structure has been faithfully restored to Gandon's design by succeeding governments. An irreplaceable loss, however, was that of the Records Office, which stood to the rear. It contained the bulk of the vast historic material of the whole island. The garrison, when surrendered, were lined up alongside the Liffey. Ironically, the River Liffey was to have been their underground escape. Through ventilation shafts, Unfortunately for them, LIVIA unobligingly was in full flood tide at the time, and this closed off their avenue of withdrawal. As the conflict continued, the casualties on both sides mounted. Free State General Michael Collins, on his way to Cork, was involved in an ambush at a place called Béal-na-Blá. He emerged from the safety of the armoured vehicle Slieve-na-Mon, and in the affray that followed, he was mortally wounded. The mystery of his death has never been explained to anybody's satisfaction. It was called Civil War, but Confused War may have been a more pertinent title. Families, friends, brothers, sisters were opposed in this terrible split. And when it all ended, after about 2 years, nothing but bitterness remained. In Dublin, the new administration had taken up residence in Leinster House, acquired from the Royal Dublin Society, which in turn had moved to Ballsbridge. Some of the great names of the previous administration were now gone. Griffiths had died in St. Vincent's Hospital on St. Stephen's Green. De Valera was on the run, a wanted man. At first, a rigid type of government under Cosgrave, nervous of any question of its authority of power, quickly suppressed agitation. Labour was particularly curtailed, and the unions were distrusted, and strikes were outlawed. But the new Free State survived. So did Northern Ireland, presided over by Dubliner Carson at its Stormont Parliament. Recognition came slowly to the new Dáil Éireann. At home, a new police force called the Garda Síochána was set up. A regular army was set up, and such institutions during those early formative years. Alongside this, a rebuilding program got underway, bearing in mind the destruction which was caused to the centre of the city during both the 1916 rebellion and the Civil War of 1922. The forecourts, the GPO, the Custom House, the Gresham Hotel, all called for care in their restoration, and the intention was to restore the splendour of the old city of Dublin once again. By the 1930s, people had had time for reflection. Those involved in the earlier civil struggle re-emerged. De Valera took the oath of allegiance with the intention of abolishing it when in power. But this was going to take time. For 5 years, he would sit opposite to those who had founded the Free State. De Valera launched his party Fianna Fáil, the Republican Party. Cosgrave and Dillon emerged to become Fine Gael, the United Ireland Party. Labour stayed largely in the workplace alongside Larkin. As president in 1932, De Valera was able to welcome the papal legate, Laurie, to Dublin's Phoenix Park. It was the year of the Eucharistic Congress. Count John McCormack, international Irish tenor, attracted worldwide attention. Visitors came from all parts of the world to Dublin through its port. Alongside all this, a recognition and respect for differing points of political view quickly emerged. Even in the face of economic poverty and the most dreadful slum conditions, Dublin's free spirit prevailed. In 1937, De Valera, with some Labour Dáil support, felt strong enough to change the constitution. It was decided to go for a referendum. This constitution would include in it the national aspiration for a united Ireland. De Valera's constitution was an independent answer to Westminster's intrusion into any Irish affairs. He had his way, and the constitution was accepted. Ambassadorial rather than consular representation abroad, and the handing over of naval ports still held by His Majesty's Navy were the main issues. The name Éire was to be proudly borne on the ships of a neutral state sailing out of Dublin's port. De Valera stood aloof, a neutral, in that great conflict of Nazi Germany and the rest of Europe, World War II. He resisted the offers to achieve a united Ireland made by Winston Churchill in return for joining the Allies. Neither was he provoked into a reaction by the callous German bombing of the North Strand area of Dublin in 1941, in which 77 people died. But De Valera was not insensitive to the conflict either. When the capital city of the north, Belfast, was devastated by bombing in the 1940s, he ordered the Dublin Fire Brigade to rush the 90 miles across the border to its assistance.
Speaker, Prime Minister, members of the Parliament, I'm grateful for your welcome and for that of your countrymen.
Who will ever forget the visit to Ireland of President John F. Kennedy? He visited the aging President, De Valera, in the Phoenix Park, Dublin, in 1963. The full cycle of history had turned. Two presidents, both born in America, both of Irish stock. The meeting was in the Phoenix Park. The venue, Áras an Uachtaráin, one time Viceregal Lodge. The climate of change had already come well before De Valera was to obtain that high office of president. In the Ireland of the 60s, taking over as his successor was Taoiseach, Prime Minister, an astute Dublin businessman, Sean Lemass. He, of course, was a previous member of the Dáil, being a minister in De Valera's government. He was a pragmatist. He had advanced ideas about the economy of the 1960s. Lemass wished to establish a modern industrialised base in Ireland with advances in communications open to new ideas. It helped that as a boy he had played a minor role as a messenger in the 1916 Rising. It must be remembered that De Valera at this stage was now its sole surviving commandant. Lemass headed a new, self-assured people wishing to see economic advances. His plans reflected on the fabric of the city of Dublin in the 1960s. Revitalisation of the city centre got underway. An airport at Collinstown took shape, about 8 miles out on the flat countryside of Fingal. Transatlantic flights were started. In the city, unused warehouses were demolished to make way for a new concept in a transport terminal. This was to be called the Bus Áras, the architect Michael Scott. Today, alongside, stands Dublin's financial services centre of the 1990s. It has been built on infilled dry dock. Scott's example of the 60s would be followed by Liberty Hall, the highest building on the Liffey side. Further up Abbey Street stands the new Abbey Theatre, the old destroyed by fire. Ghosts of the great actresses and actors of the past tinged the air in this historic site. But further up Dame Street still stands the ornate Victorian Olympia Theatre. There always seems to have been a theatre in this area. The Olympia had been preceded by Dan Lowry's Music Hall. The excavations in Wood Quay in the 1960s unearthed the foundations of the ancient Norse city of the distant past. Standing on that site now are the recently built civic offices in the shadow of Christ Church. Their presence still excites debate and controversy. In those years of the 1960s, survival of Dublin's cultural soul was under severe threat on many fronts. Thanks to the efforts of the then Lord Longford and his wife Christine, the Gate Theatre near the Rotunda Hospital was kept open. And there that noted theatre duo of player and producer, Nihal MacLeamore and Hilton Edwards performed.
See the lights of Dublin winking at each other in the gloom. Dublin, the capital city of Ireland. Oh well, it's our city. It's our willful, wicked old city. Strumpet city in the sunset, suckling the bastard brats of Scot, of English Ray, of Huguenot. Brave sons breaking from the womb, wild sons fleeing from their mother. Wistful city of savage dreamers, so old, so sick with memories. Old mother. Some, they say, are damned. But you, I think, one day shall walk the streets of paradise, head high and unashamed. There. Now let my epitaph be written.
McLeod, an artist of many dimensions, had produced his own entertainment, his magnificent solo performance, The Importance of Being Oscar. He played it here in the Gay Theatre, and then in the larger Gaiety Theatre near St. Stephen's Green. After that, it was to travel the world and bring author Oscar Wilde further fame. Wilde had grown up in Dublin's Merrion Square, in a house near the National Gallery. McLeod and Edwards lived together in the Regency Harcourt Terrace, and today that house is lived in by theatre impresario Noel Pearson. And so the cycle continues. Such buildings in the 1960s were saved by both individual effort and by bodies such as the National Heritage Trust An Taisce. An Taisce houses its headquarters in Dublin's Taylor's Hall, the only surviving city guild hall. Like a precious magnet, it has attracted to its core a renewal area. In medieval times, the city had marked its centre here with a cross. In modern times, it has now returned to this centre. And the buildings here, whether hotels or residential or commercial, must be sufficiently sympathetic to the environs in order to gain planning approval. Renewal and rejuvenation of the city of Dublin has always been the secret of its survival. Christ Church itself had deteriorated greatly by the middle of the 19th century, but through the generosity of an enlightened Dublin distiller called Rowe, it was faithfully restored. Later again, another building, the Royal College of Science, whose foundation stone was laid in 1904, was to become the government office of An Taisce near Leinster House. High up on Howth Head, overlooking the city and its bay by Sutton, is St. Fintan's Cemetery. And here McLeod and Edwards lie finally side by side. In their lifetime, artistic, outrageous, contentious soulmates, here they find their final curtain together. They may rest peacefully in this place, overlooking Dublin city. Their view of the bay, uninterrupted by applause. They view a city boasting new aspects within its great north and south walls. By the one-time bustling quayside where ships discharge their cargo, now stand modern townhouses and apartments and commercial quarters. Further out in deep water, cruising and commercial liners wait for entry to the port. Along the entire city length of the river, there is rebuilding and refurbishment continuing apace and is much in demand. Ormond would approve. Traffic from the north to the south is now carried by the sleek toll bridge, the Eastlink. And the nearby depot, close to the Eastlink, which at one time served the great marshalling railway yards of the last century, is now an international venue for opera and ballet and music generally, and of course the Eurovision Song Contest. Side by side with these, Dublin has developed an always emerging inspiration in building, arts, culture, innovation and languages. The ghosts not only of Swift and of Stella, but of Joyce and O'Casey are all found here and more. It's part of the timeless flow of the tide, the running of the river, and LIVIA Plurabella. Just like Molly Malone, alive, alive, oh, this is Dublin's fair city. Looking up the river, LIVIA, or over her outstretched bay, the ribbons of light engulf the eye. Her red-hot South Bull lighthouse, the Pigeon House, the white light of her Marion monument marking the tip of her North Bull, all held between Bray and Bionader's Head. Here then is LIVIA, here then is Dublin, here then is Ablana, Baile Ahatlia, Dublin, a city of splendour and a timeless heritage.